welcome everybody. Welcome to this first presentation. My name is Dusing. I'm a certified LabVIEW architect, despite what the sheet says. It was a recent test for me, so hey, join the club. Thank you. I gave this presentation last year at NI Week, so if any of you were actually at this, you might want to run across to the other room, but otherwise, glad you're all here, and we're excited to talk to you a little bit about user interface and user experience design. It's been a personal interest of mine during my programming career, and I'm hopefully going to give you a couple tools and helpful hints as to how to make a better user interface and user experience, specifically with your LabVIEW applications. So a little bit of background about the company I work for, DMC. We're an engineering and software consulting firm specializing in automation. We've got offices throughout the country, and we're about 180 people and growing. And we've got lots of LabVIEW architects and developers on our team that work on these projects. We kind of have four key service areas. Manufacturing automation, so that's Siemens, Allen Bradley, Rockwell. Test and measurement, which is the team I'm really on, that does National Instruments hardware and LabVIEW software. Some custom software and hardware development, some embedded consulting, and Microsoft consulting services. And a lot of times our solutions encompass one or more of the areas, and so we kind of join forces across our entire company to bring together comprehensive solutions. So that's a little bit about what we do. I primarily do LabVIEW development, and so that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about. And I'm actually from our Chicago office. We've got a Seattle office here, and they invited me to come help out with this. So to get here, I had to book a plane ticket. This slide was taken from the NI Week slide deck, so it shows Austin, but I flew to Seattle. And I'm sure like many of you guys, everybody's here has booked a plane ticket, right? Everybody's familiar with that process. Okay, not enough hands went up on that. We'll go ahead with it. So what do you have to do to buy a plane ticket? Well, of course, you have to fill out your destination and where you're looking to go. But also you need to fill out your phone number. And one of the things that I've noticed is every once in a while I'll be typing in my phone number and look up and I'm finished. And it never auto-tabbed to the next box for me. It only took the first three characters. And I have to go click myself. And then you get asked for your date of birth. And you're trying to fill in your the year, and you need to scroll through the 1890s, early 1900s to get to the year you were born. It's more scrolling for some of you than others. And then you've got your credit card number, and this is where the lazy developer who wrote this form decided that you need to specify both the credit card type and the credit card number when they could have done that lookup themselves from the number. And then finally you hit OK, not realizing you missed that field that was kind of hidden off to the side. And after you hit the OK button, it tells you, oh, hey, you didn't fill in all the fields. And by the way, for security measures, all your information's been deleted. It's time to start over. Yeah. This is a wonderful user experience. It makes me want to book with that company again. And that's kind of the crux of what this presentation is about. It doesn't matter how beautiful that form is when you're filling it out. It matters more about your experience with it. So I think these ketchup bottles nicely describe the difference between user interface design, which is important, don't get me wrong, and versus the user experience. And we'll talk a little bit about both today. So as the backbone of this whole presentation, I'll be leveraging Peter Morville's UX Honeycomb. Now, Peter Morville is a pioneer in the information architecture and user experience industry. He's been doing this for more than 20 years. And he came up with this honeycomb as a way to identify what the key tenets are to developing a good user experience, which in turn makes an application valuable. So we'll be talking about all these things from a desirable, accessible, credible, findable, usable, and useful application. So we'll dive into each of those and talk about what does that really mean and what can you do to really address those concerns in your LabVIEW programming. And along the way, I have a couple of tools that we made along the way. Those are going to be made available. I guess some of them are going to be made available, the ones that we could easily release. I've got some links at the end. If you're interested in checking those out and playing around with them a bit more. So we can start off here, and we'll focus on desirable to begin, because I think that's the one that most of you will be the most familiar with. This has the most overlap with typical user interface design, which I think is more common, that people have some background in UI design versus this user experience idea. So what is an application that's desirable? It's one that draws the user to it. They want to use it, they look at it, and they're like, hey, this is really appealing. So this really kind of comes down to the controls and indicators that you're using in your LabVIEW application, as well as the color selection. And then it's kind of a point here, we're going to talk about graphs, because that's kind of a combination of both controls and colors, and the color is very essential for that. So some of you may know, LabVIEW 2018 now ships with a new controls palette, which is pretty darn exciting, because we've been stuck with the silver since before I started using LabVIEW. This is the NXG control palette. If you're already using LabVIEW NXG, then this is probably what you're used to using. It's a big step up from the modern, classic, and silver control palettes that were available to date. So I recommend checking this out, but if you're like me and this still doesn't quite cut it for you, there's been plenty of investment in the NI community to release good, better user interfaces for LabVIEW, because most of the time, who here can tell a LabVIEW application when they look at it? Yeah, that shouldn't be the case. That's not good. So hopefully this doesn't just look like LabVIEW. And a lot of other companies out there have made their own UI suites. DMC has one too. We make ours available on our website, and it's going through the process of being released on the Tools Network. So check ours or any of the other ones out. Just don't worry about reinventing the wheel. And don't feel like you have to use the modern control palette from NI. So now that you've selected a good kind of base for your controls and indicators, we can talk about colors. And I could give a whole hour-long presentation on colors. There you could probably find people who could talk for days about colors. So to keep this fairly simple, what we typically tell our developers and our team is pick one or two colors and use a color tool like the Adobe Color Wheel to find good colors. Don't just guess. And so what the Adobe Color Wheel can give you is you can pick a color and it can give you what the complementary color is. And as you can see, it can give you a good few shades of those colors. That way you're not guessing. And then you can grab neutrals if you need additional colors or shading. But a lot of us, we're engineers, we're not user interface designers. We shouldn't try to bring 4 or 5 different colors all together in an application, because 95% of the time it's going to fail. So keep it simple, and it can still look really clean and professional. And when in doubt, like the Adobe Color Wheel, they have this button here. What that can do is take colors from a picture or from another website, and you can leverage the work that somebody else has already made in coming up with a good color scheme. So you can take colors from a website, which is good. And colors is obviously really, really important for your entire application. Very important for something like a graph. I'm sure a lot of you guys use graphs. It's a kind of a central piece of test and measurement applications. And so looking at this graph, I'm not sure if you guys are going to be able to see this like I am, but do any of the colors stick out a bit more than others in this one? Like how about this blue one down here? Does this kind of pop a little bit more than some of that lighter blue up top? This is the default color arrangement for a graph, and it's not the best because they don't have the same intensity. When you're displaying a graph, you usually want the data to be displayed with the same intensity unless some is really more important, some lines are really more important than others. So to come up with a better set of colors for a graph, which we've done, is we want to use unique colors, but ones with similar intensity. So to talk about how to do this, we need to change how we think about colors a little bit. A lot of times we think about colors as RGB values, red, green, blue, intensity, 0 to 255. But we can also think about colors in terms of their hue, saturation, and luminosity. And what I'm proposing for changing the graph colors is to keep the value and saturation the same, but then vary hue. And by only changing hue, what you do is you maintain the intensity of the color, but you change the shade of it. So as you can see here, we have an array of colors that are all about the same intensity, which is awesome. But unfortunately, just picking random colors won't solve all of our problems, because now, like these first four out of the first 5 look pretty darn similar. We wouldn't want to use that in the graph. So we need to be more strategic about picking our colors. One way to do that is to use the golden ratio. Has anybody ever heard of the golden ratio? Good, okay, a couple people, that's great. The golden ratio is 1.618. That's not the most important part. What's the most important is this is a naturally occurring ratio. You will find this ratio almost anywhere you look. You got a hurricane in there, you've got a sunflower, a snail shell, even the human face has the golden ratio built into its geometry. And humans, we can tell if something abides by the golden ratio or not. That's why it's been used for millennia on sculptures and architecture, and more recently web design that has been leveraging this golden ratio to make layouts look really nice and appealing and professional, because people can perceive it. So if we take 1 divided by the golden ratio and move about this color wheel here, we'll end up picking out colors that are nicely spaced, so that whether you're picking 3 or 50 colors, they're as about unique as you can get. And you can see here we created a new array of colors with the golden ratio at that given intensity. And even the first like 12 are fairly different enough that you could easily differentiate them. And so you can take a graph that looks like this, apply that color scheme instead, and you end up with something like this. Something that's a lot more appealing and nice to use. And so we do have a VI that does generate these colors automatically for you. This is part of that tool set I mentioned earlier. So if you want to check this out, you don't have to worry too much about the math. But just know that like the LabVIEW graphs don't necessarily come with the best colors. You might want to use a more intelligent design. So that's a bit about creating a desirable application, the controls, the colors. So now we're going to focus on another UX tenet, which is accessibility. This is probably one that we don't often think about, but it's very, very closely related to the user interface design itself. Because the idea behind accessibility is that everyone should be able to use your application in a similar way. They should have a similar experience of it. And for a lot of people with color vision deficiency, some applications are quite difficult to use. So we're going to talk about some solutions to that as well, and what we can reasonably do within LabVIEW to solve that problem. So color vision deficiency affects about 2 out of every 25 people. It's much more prevalent in males than females. Judging by the population in this room, I'm guessing there's a handful of people here that don't see this rainbow on the left like we see it, but are looking at kind of maybe one of the other bars on the right. And so as good developers, we need to consider that our user base might not see the rainbow as we see it. And then we should take that into account in order to avoid some pitfalls. Because you can run into something like this, where that nice graph that we made can look more like one of these two over on the middle and the right. Especially in the middle, which affects about 1.5% of people, you can see that there is a great deal of difficulty differentiating a lot of those lines. And the line color is quite essential to understanding what the person's even looking at. So what can we do? One solution is to add texture to the lines. So what I've done here is simply overlaid 2 plots of the same data, one with a lighter shade and a darker one on top that has a line texture. And what this does is it allows even the middle view to be able to be linked to what the data actually means. You can differentiate the lines now, which you couldn't before when they were just solid. So it's the same data, but now much easier to read, and even those who don't have color deficiency could benefit from something like this. What else can we do? There are plenty of times where we want to use color to identify something about the application. So maybe a file path is incorrect, and you want to highlight that to the user and say, hey, this isn't right. Instead of just highlighting it red, instead have text that says what's wrong. The file is not found. 1, that's more informative. But 2, it's not going to be missed. It's not solely relying on color to indicate something. You can also have Boolean text over your indicators, so there's no confusion as to whether something's green or red. And you can use icons. Icons are known as the universal language, because even people who speak different languages can interpret the meaning of a lot of common icons. I guess even more importantly is over time, humans have evolved to be very visually oriented beings. We have excellent pattern recognition skills. And while I'm sure you guys are all really good at reading, I guarantee you that your pattern recognition skills might even be better than that. And so when you look at a button or a tree or a list box over there and you use icons, all of a sudden the meaning of it can jump out at you much, much quicker, especially after you gain some familiarity with what the icons mean, as opposed to just having the text where you have to read everything. So it can be helpful for all of your end users, and so I highly recommend using icons. One word of caution on that, I don't want to lead you astray here. Use labels with your icons. It's pretty important. A study was done, and you can see that with common icons that were labeled, about 90% of the user base was able to determine before clicking on a button what it was going to do. If you take away the labels, comprehension rates dropped to around 60%. And how many people here write custom applications that might have some unique functionality? Anybody? Okay. Probably a lot of you guys? Yeah. If you use unique icons without labels, maybe not like just a start or a stop or a cancel icon, but some special icon to control a device, all of a sudden your comprehension rate drops to 33% if it doesn't have a label. So context here is very important. Add some tip strips or labels to help the end user understand what this new symbol means. All right. Another tenet we're going to talk about here with UX design is findability. So we say an application is findable when the user can easily orient themselves within the application. So imagine you're going to a shopping mall and none of the stores have the signs above them saying what they are. That would be quite confusing. You'd have to go into a couple and be like, is this Banana Republic or American Eagle? I have no idea. The same is true with your application. If you don't have a very findable application, your user can be navigating it and just confused at where they are, what they're actually looking at. A couple of solutions to this are using good application layouts that leverage consistency with what the user is expecting from the outside world. Adding some animation, you'll see why in a little bit. And as kind of an anecdote, I want to start with talking about drop-downs versus search bars. This is one minor point of findability, but how many of you have ever used a drop-down to have the user select an option from a list, right? I think a lot of people here, they're pretty useful tools. Wouldn't it be awesome if there was like a Google type of search, a filtering selector, like the video on the, is it not going to play? Oh man, that's a bummer. Oh man, it's going to be tough. Okay. All right, you type in the search bar over there, and the list would filter down to just what the user wants. What that's going to do is make what they're looking for more findable. Because once you get above like 20 or so, and even above 10 elements in a list box, all of a sudden the user has to like scroll around, and it makes it very, very difficult to select what they're looking for. When they can just filter by text, like Google, I mean, there's a reason Google doesn't use a list box for their search results. Crazy. Kind of taking a step back out here, that's one way to make specific data selection more findable. But you want your whole application to be findable. You want it to be navigable. You want your user to be able to figure out what they need, where to go, how to do what they want to do. And for that, it's really important to use an application layout that has parallels to other applications they might see. Because your end user base is not using your application in a vacuum. They've used applications before. They have expectations, and we need to meet those expectations instead of recreating a whole concept of what a navigation bar might be or how statuses are presented. So having a layout like this with the title bar, menu bar, navigation at the top, maybe a tool pane and a body in the middle and a status bar is quite familiar. I was actually looking at this exact design when creating this presentation. You notice that PowerPoint has this exact layout. And I will know how to navigate your application if you use the same thing as if you PowerPoint before, or some other application. What this does is it prevents the user from having to learn some basic things about how to use your application. It lowers how much they have to think about it and learn, which makes it easier for them to use. One other aspect about findability is that you want your screens within your application. You want your user to know where to go to do those tasks. So other than just having logical navigation panes and logical tab layouts and things like that, one common issue that we'll run into is with dialog boxes. I think we've all probably used dialog boxes to get input from the user or change some settings or something like that. And in this sample application here, you can see I've got a nice navigation ribbon up top, a tool pane on the left, and then a body over on the right. And I added this settings button that's going to pop up this tank settings user interface. And they're going to be able to change the two tank controls and what they're actually displaying. Now the problem is the user interface is totally decoupled from the application. The user, when they're trying to figure out again, oh hey, how do I change the settings? They need to remember, oh, there's that one button that I click to get to that. And it's kind of brought out of the context. And sometimes you might launch the same dialog box from multiple places in your application, and that almost makes it more confusing because now they can get to the same thing for multiple routes. It starts to become a little bit confusing. And that's because whether we know it or not, what our end users are doing when they're using our application is they're constructing a mental map of your application. So you see you got the main application on the top, you've got a few other like main pages there or the tool panes, and then they're kind of constructing this like web of how to get to the things they need. Now the dialog box is decoupled from the main screens, and that's where it becomes more challenging for the end user to place that tank settings UI wherever it was in your actual application. So context here is really important, and dialog boxes have weak contextual references to your main application. So one solution for this might be to not have a dialog box, but to have a pane. There was a nice animation here that unfortunately I'm not going to be able to get to work. This tank tab slides out from the left here, and then hitting the button again puts it back. This animation, by having the pane slide out from the right, is keeping the contextual reference to this main page. So they know that, oh yes, when I go to this page, I've seen that little tab on the right, that's what I need to click, and those are where the options are, and then they can get hidden afterward. And by doing that, you can keep good contextual references to your application, make your settings or other things more findable, and without having to have so many dialog boxes cluttering the screen and the user's mind. So again, another video, embedded video here that's not going to work. It's a shame, but we have an animation toolkit that we use. There are 6 VIs. Pretty darn simple. You create a slider object, and then there are a couple of different operations that you can do with it. You can snap it, you can snap and offset it, or you can just kind of like freely float an object over the UI. And with a very simple API like this, you can center something on a tab control on like the left side, have it slide out, and then have it move back with just a couple of API calls. And so doing this kind of animation, I think the reason we don't do that in LabVIEW is because it's not really like a built-in feature. It's not something that LabVIEW natively exposes. But having an API like this that kind of handles it in the background for you makes that bar to use it a lot lower. I can pull up a website that will show something like this in a minute when I get to one of the other demos that unfortunately won't show. But just know that API has already been written, and it is in the toolkit that I'll kind of reference later if you want to check it out, and I'm happy to show anybody in more detail after the presentation. All right. Next, we're going to talk about usability. So usability is all about reducing friction in your application. So we're going to talk about some of the causes of friction and then how to mitigate them. primary causes of friction are busyness, inconsistency, having unnecessary UI elements, and having things that are unfamiliar to the end user. What any of these do is it causes the user a little bit of confusion. They have to think about it a bit more, and that reduces how quickly they can use your software. It relates to Hick's law, which means that for increasing complexity in the user interface, you're going to have like a logarithmic increase in the amount of time the user's going to take to use the software. So let's take an example here of an application that I came across a while ago. Very typical LabVIEW application. It is very, very busy. You can just tell that by looking at that. I have no idea what to click on to start. And so that's going to cause me to have to take a couple of seconds to think about it or just orient myself to it. It's also inconsistent. And so we talked a little bit earlier about consistency in terms of wanting to use icons that users are familiar with. So using a triangle, that means start, right? Or a sideways triangle. Or using an X, that means cancel or bad. You don't want to reinvent those kind of icons. And we also talked about the application layout. All those things are forms of external consistency, where the end user, they know a red octagon means stop. So if you're using a red octagon in your application, that should also mean stop, and you can kind of leverage their expectations for that. So that's what we mean by external consistency. Internal consistency means within your application itself, you're not changing the meaning of stuff. But here you see we've got green booleans, we have this red room disable or stable, and then the yellow station status is up top. I think those are all Boolean statuses. It's kind of hard to tell. The application color scheme is just not really consistent, so it doesn't add meaning for me. And next, we'll see that there are a lot of unnecessary elements about this. We haven't started a test yet, but I can see all the different test stations that are active. That's just confusing. I don't know if I need to go there first or if those are just because the developer was too lazy to hide them before I started the test. Those are things that shouldn't be there. Your user interface should direct the user toward what they need to do. And then finally, since, as we mentioned, a lot of you guys do custom applications, you're going to have some things that are just not quite familiar to the user that they probably haven't run into in other applications. So for instance, this application used the PC and the CRIO, and they were going to store settings on the PC and some on the CRIO as well. And instead of having one nice UI that just gave the end user all the configurable options they wanted and then handle in the background where the settings get stored, the developer here has decided to make their problem the end user's problem, and the end user has to remember what settings are stored on what thing. And that's just unfamiliar and adds more confusion to the application. So if we revamp this application, we can change it to be something more like this. And this looks a lot better for a number of reasons. One, the UI is more modern. But then also, there's more white space. There's less busyness, and that's kind of a good solution to your busyness problem, is to add a white space. Some studies have shown that just adding more white space to your application increases user comprehension by about 20%, just by adding more white space. So that's pretty easy to do. This also has external consistency and internal consistency with the color scheme and just overall layout. Simplicity. As you can see, we've taken a lot of the options that were on the user interface and removed it. Those are in better places now where the options are only shown when they need to be shown. And that helps the user focus on what the buttons that they want to click are. And then it's also task focused. As you notice, the graph is the biggest thing in this UI. That's because we knew that when the developer was on the screen, they needed to see how their parts were passing compared to the overall limits that they had set. So designing the UI with the end goal of what the operator is going to want to do in mind. So one common challenge with creating frictionless interfaces is having an end user who's like, okay, yeah, that's like a really nice user interface, but now I need to see this and this and this and everything. I need to see everything. A lot of times our applications are going to use different pages, different tabs, and these end users are going to be dissatisfied when we show them our application that has these different tabs, and they're like, no, but now I need to flip back and forth between these two tabs. to see the two things that I want to at the same time. That's a pretty common challenge. So one solution is we can just move all of these controls and indicators onto one UI, right? No. If you're squeamish, you should probably close your eyes, because you end up with the monolith UI, which is kind of similar to what we were seeing earlier. It's super cluttered, you don't know where to go with it. This is not an option. We need to separate out our logic, our user interface into tabs or different views, because this is just too much to take in, too much to comprehend. So we can split it up maybe into a bunch of floating windows, and that's one option. I have seen this work, but it's difficult to manage for a couple of reasons. One, you got all these floating windows all over the place, and you need like a user that's super diligent or has OCD to keep them all nicely arranged. They can fall on top of each other, fall behind each other. It just doesn't feel very nice. So this was maybe the best solution we had seen for a while, but we kind of went on a quest for a dynamic way of presenting information, because we've seen that having, showing all the information is overwhelming, having separate tabs is restricting, having floating panels is cluttered or disorganized. So addressing these dynamic user needs, or needs that change over time with what the user might care to look at, it's kind of a big problem. And I think there are a number of ways to address this. My goal for the next couple of slides here is to show a solution that we've come up with. Might not be the best solution, but just to kind of get the wheels turning in your guys' brains as to how to solve this problem in a good, flexible way. So we came up with this user interface that had a grid structure of subpanels. And the idea was each subpanel was a place where you could drop an interface module. So maybe you've got a power supply, and you've got another device, and you've got like a results view. We want the end user to be able to configure that however they want, or not show those different interface modules if they don't want them. And the other idea would be if you have different interfaces that need to be different sized, you could just expand the subpanel to take up more than one grid space. So this is where I'll kind of go off the chart here. Give me one sec. I want to be able to show you this. So this is what the, it's not very big. Let me see if I can get that bigger. There we go. So this is what the grid viewer looks like. As you can see, you've got this list on the left. You can pull that out, that's showing the animation toolkit there, and you can drag and drop it into one of the panels. You can also drag, this is a 2x2 grid interface that you can pull it out and kind of populate it, customize it totally to what your needs are. In here, I think you'll see that you can actually pop out the interfaces if you need a little bit more room or you add an extra monitor. You don't need to change how the application is designed. You can just kind of move some of those windows over. And then finally, I think there's maybe one more example here. You can replace what's already there just by kind of dragging and dropping over top of it. The grid viewer is kind of keeping track of what interfaces it's displaying at any given time. So this is kind of the architecture that we came up with to address this need for a couple of difficult projects that we were encountering, where the end user couldn't really define what they needed to look for. This probably isn't a solution that you need for every project. Sometimes your end users really know what they want, and it's maybe a production line, and they're really not going to change what they care about. But other times, especially in the R&D type of environments, their needs are constantly changing. They're adding new devices every once in a while, and you want a dynamic way of being able to present this information. And so that's why we came up with this solution. It's not exactly a simple solution, but as you can see, it's pretty powerful. I'd be happy to talk more about this particular VI after the presentation, since there's a lot to talk about. And yeah, that video isn't finished, unfortunately, but luckily I had the website. All right, so credibility. Credibility is all about having your end users trust you. So to do this, we're going to talk about consistency again. That's a really key takeaway from this, and responsive design. Okay, imagine this one changes from gray to green, and that one changes from gray to red. What's the middle one? Is it on or disabled, or is it off or faulted?
Right.
It would be really hard to tell. If you have two different booleans that look just like it that are changed between gray and green and gray and red, I have no idea what the middle one's going to do until I see it. And because there's no booleans, I actually have no idea what the current status is. And so this is where if you had an application that used these three things, it would lack consistency. And without consistency, your end user is not going to be able to comprehend what the status of that pump is. And without the comprehension, they're going to lose trust in your application, not just in this part, but in the data you're presenting on the graph on the next screen. And without their trust, you as the developer, your application loses its credibility. So that's why consistency is maybe the greatest contributing factor to whether or not the end user trusts the data that your application is telling them about. All right, and then responsive design is the other way to give the user good confidence in your application. How many of you here have used an application where you clicked on something and then nothing happened? And then you're stuck there wondering, is it doing anything? I don't know, maybe it takes 30 seconds. I guess I'll wait. And then maybe I missed my command, I don't know. UI responsiveness is really important. You want the UI to let the user know, hey, I got your request, I'm working on that. If it's a long process, having a progress bar or a busy wheel or something to let them know, like, this is getting done is important. One way to reduce the amount of time things take, and there are certain operations in LabVIEW that take a ton of time. List box updates, tree updates, stuff like that can take a long period of time, especially when you start getting a lot of data. Deferring panel updates is probably the easiest solution I can give you in the short presentation to improving the performance of your application. It'll essentially stop the UI thread from pulling updates until you re-enable it. So you can kind of defer panel updates before doing a complex operation where you're updating a tree each node by node, and then re-enable them at the end, and you won't take as big of a performance hit. We've seen massive improvements in our performance just by enabling and disabling the defer panel updates. MGI has a VI to do this. You can also do this just via an invoke node. I think it's like a pane property or something like that. It's a property node. Thank you. Property node.
The only thing that bugs me about the defer panel updates is the first thing it does is update the front panel.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. So it basically updates the front panel twice. Once when you defer it, and then once when you undefer it. So just to let you know.
Yeah,
it bugs me. I wish there may be a technical reason why that has to be done, but it's frustrating.
Didn't know that. But yeah, I guess something to consider. I think most of the time, if you're going to be calling this, you might run into cases where you still will probably save a number of UI updates.
Save time.
Yeah.
Especially updating like tables, like if you want to go through a table and update different colors or something like that.
Yeah.
It's the only way to go.
It's the only way to do it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't know that.
Okay.
So yeah, defer panel updates is something to look into for your application if you're running into performance issues. The other way to create a nice responsive design is to use what I'm going to call hover buttons. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have used applications where when your mouse moves over something, it changes colors to say, hey, like I can see that your mouse is moving, I see that you're over something that's clickable, I'm going to let you know that that's clickable. We're in a world today, especially with LabVIEW, where we're using flat design. So we don't have those giant 3D bevels on our buttons anymore that lets the user know, hey, this is a button that looks just like a real mechanical one. You've got flat buttons like this. And sometimes those can look like decorations or indicators. So having the UI change colors lets the end user know, oh, hey, I can click that. Unfortunately, it's not really built in super nicely to LabVIEW to be able to do that. They made some progress with the LabVIEW NXG controls where those do have the hover over states, but there's still a little bit of effort to go through and modify those. So what we did is we created a VI, and again, the animation's not going to work. A VI that what it does is you spin it up and it launches a little process that runs in the background. It keeps track of all the buttons on your UI and then automatically updates that. And so that can add a bit of responsiveness to your UI just by dropping in one single VI at the start of your user interface. The downside of that is it does require a little bit of, while the application is running, it does require a little bit of UI thread to actually process, so that may or may not be a good fit depending on how complex or how intensive your application is. But we found that it's worked kind of nicely for some of the simpler user interfaces or applications. It has that nice responsive feature. Yeah.
If you use a system Boolean button,
You can do it with the system Boolean buttons. It does require.
They do have the hover over built into them.
Right, yeah, so the NXG and the system buttons have 6 states, whereas all the other buttons have 4 states. The actual 2 states are for the mouse over pressed and mouse over unpressed states. The downside is that for the system buttons, you need to use image backgrounds for them. So if you want to change the size of the button later, it can be kind of annoying to need to recreate all those images. Versus these buttons are all made using LabVIEW decorations as the background of it, and those scale much nicer in LabVIEW. So you can change the button size a lot easier. But that's definitely an option if you have a very static UI.
You can't change colors and stuff like that on the system buttons. I'm talking about
Right,
regular
right.
LabVIEW with system.
With system buttons without using images as the background for the buttons.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that I've done is to use system buttons in a radio control button, the radio button control, and then use that for my tabs instead of LabVIEW tabs.
Yeah, we do that as well using the radio buttons for a nicer tab control, because tabs don't always look as nice. Yeah, again, any of these things I'm happy to talk about a bit more after the presentation. Unfortunately, some of my little demos here aren't working, but hopefully you're getting a sense of what's possible. The last tenet of user experience design that we're going to talk about is usefulness. This is maybe the easiest to understand, but maybe the hardest to implement. So first thing that we often do when we're creating an application is you make sure that your application is going to do something useful. It's got a purpose. It's got a function it's supposed to serve. The second question that you need to ask is, does your application actually do that job, or does it fail? A lot of times we'll get an application that does something useful and it'll work and we'll stop. This is as high up on the UX hierarchy of needs as we make it. The next step, though, is to make it coherent. Is your application simple, and is it consistent? We talked a lot today about the external and internal consistency, so keeping those in mind gets you up to this point with application coherence. The next step is reducing friction, making it really intuitive for your end users, and designing it with their focus in mind. If they're trying to accomplish something, you want your application to aid that, not hinder it. And then finally, I think one that we rarely think about is your user interface, is your application engaging? Is it responsive? Is it enjoyable to use? Do your end users use your application and like, this is like a really awesome application, it helps me do my job, or do they complain about how difficult it is to figure out what they need to do? You want them to leave with a sense that they were able to do their job a lot quicker because they had the application that you made for them. So shoot for enjoyable there. And there we have the 6 tenets of the UX honeycomb that leads to a better user experience and a more valuable application. I know we covered a lot in a short period of time, so here's kind of a takeaways list. So for desirability, just remember the UI is still important. Use a good UI suite. There are plenty available for free or very cheap out there. Accessibility, think about all your end users, especially in terms of your color selection and icon usage. Findability, use expected layouts, and just remember that your application is not made in a vacuum. Your user has expectations, and you want to live up to those. For usability, remove friction, increase white space is maybe the easiest tip to take away from this. Don't have so many options on the screen the user doesn't know where to click next. And then credibility is all about that internal and external consistency and adding UI responsiveness so the user can feel confident that your application is doing something for them and not just spinning there frozen. And then useful and for enjoyable. You want your end users to really like using your application. So I only have a few minutes left here, I think. So what's next for you? I know you didn't really get to see the animation like slide a little bit on some of the videos I showed you on the website, but there's an animation toolkit here that's got the color generator that I mentioned, the slider object, and the hover buttons that I mentioned before. If you want to try any of those toolkits out, they're pretty easy to get started with, and you can download them on our website. You can also download our GUI suite from our website. I'm hoping within the next week it'll be up on the LabVIEW Tools Network. We're in the middle of the process of getting that online with them. And then a couple of the other resources that I mentioned today. But hopefully that better equips you guys to create good user interfaces with a focus on the end user's experience. I think we have just a couple of, do we have a little bit of time for questions? Yeah? Yeah.
No, I'm telling you, 5 minutes.
5 minutes for questions? Cool, yeah, I'll take some.
All right, thanks. So that was really cool and insightful. Thanks for that. One question. So since as an integrator, the challenge is always it's a one-off and it is a complicated problem that's unlike all other problems. So do you do kind of I want to say UX reviews as part of your process, or do you just apply best practices along certain levels?
So you're asking if we have user experience design as part of our project process?
Yes, that, and do you like is that yes?
Okay. So it really depends on the size of the project. Sometimes we get projects that the client's budget is 15, 20K. That's basically enough time to get a proof of concept working system. And at that, our job as consultants is to let them know that, yeah, we can get this proof of concept system up and running. It's not going to have all the bells and whistles that regular application design takes. So we let them know that ideally you'd want to take this all the way if it's something they care about. But for bigger applications, we do some 100K projects or $1 million projects, and for those, absolutely, we do build in that user experience design as part of the cost of the project, and we have a user UI UX, I guess what we call a user interface expert on our team. I'm a LabVIEW developer with a hobby of user interface and user experience design, but we have some people on the marketing team that do this as their job, so we leverage them for the bigger project work that actually wants to pay for this value, because it is value add. Any other questions about anything we talked about today? Yeah.
One of the tools that I found really useful for this training is there are tools now called XTab.
XTab?
And it allows you to have dynamic tabs that you can create and destroy in real time with any program versus static tab controls that you get with LabVIEW. And it gives you that experience that you have with, say, a web browser where you can create more tabs, you can move and tear off tabs, merge them back, just like Google, Chrome, or anything like that. And now I have it in every single application. So
Awesome.
looking for that functionality. It's available. It's not that hard to use.
Yeah, two quick questions on that. One, does that use, is that just like a regular CTL, or what, is that an X?
So it's an X control.
It's an X control?
It's using a subpanel to host the tab's UI. So you basically can embed any UI into your tab.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual tab control on the top is some custom graphics that they do. And you can even drag and resort them. It deals with having too many tabs to fit on the screen with the ability to scroll over and view more tabs. You can custom name the label on it. There's a lot of cool features about it. And it takes a little bit of learning curve. I'm not going to say it's super easy, but it's doable. And I've deployed it in many applications for several years now.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, the one concern with X controls is always, is it well vetted? Because you can run into some problems with X controls. But if it's well vetted, where can people find more about that?
On the Tools Network, it's made by Saphir, which is a French consultant, a LabVIEW developer,
Yeah, I would say they're pretty reliable.
They've got some good stuff up there, but I recommend everyone take a look at that one if you want that kind of UI. Again, what you were saying is what the user expects now.
Mhm.
Now you cannot deliver it any other way that I've been able to find.
Right, yeah. One of the big takeaways is just let's try to get LabVIEW to be more like the user interface that people are used to on their web apps, on their mobile devices, things like that. So, looks like I'm out of time right now. I'd be happy to take any further questions outside, but thanks everybody very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.